Last week, we started the book of Esther. You guys remember? Chapter 1, chapter 2, not super pretty. If you missed last week, you could easily catch up by reading Esther 1 and Esther 2. You'll find tons of abuse, tons of evil. You can see sin and evil at the highest levels of society and how its effects drip down over everybody else. And noticeably absent is God. In name, in reference, no prayers, no prophecy, no speaking. He doesn't even seem to be acting. And my guess is practically everybody in this place has had a season of your life that you felt like was just full of evil. And God didn't seem to be speaking. And God didn't seem to be showing up. But we learned last week that even in those crazy, terrible moments, God is always working behind the scenes. In fact, during VBS this week, I think it was night 2, they always summarize the Bible point into one thing. And those of you who are here could help me out if I was wrong on the day. But day 2's point was, when life is unfair, God is good. Well, look at that. There's people who are still repeating it, just like VBS. You could probably summarize Esther 1 and 2 with that line. Life was super unfair to Esther. And we don't know how he's working and why he's working and when things are going to come to a conclusion, but we know he is working. And we know he's still good. Xerxes makes all of these decisions, and it trickles down all the way into a beautiful, orphaned Jewish Esther. She becomes made queen. She finds herself in a position of power and influence that becomes immediately necessary. Because at the end of chapter 2, which we didn't read last week, there's an assassination plot. Some of the people who are guarding Xerxes are very unhappy with him, and they're about to whack him. You know who hears about it? Mordecai, Esther's cousin turned daddy figure. And because of his ability to have access to the king through Esther, they foil the assassination plot. Here's how it's recorded in verse 23. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the 2 men were impaled on a sharpened pole. This was all recorded then, this is important, in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. Now, for the rest of today, this story has little to no significance. But I want to introduce a point which we will circle back to next week, and it will have a ton of significance. It's this: God's favor doesn't have an expiration date. God's favor doesn't come with an expiration date. It's really, really important for us to grasp and understand. But for now, the story continues. We're told sometime later, chapter 3, verse 1. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, an Agagite, over all other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by. This is what the king commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. The palace officials at the king's gate, which is where Mordecai would hang out, asked him, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" This is a real question, like we want to know. And it says they spoke to him day after day, but he still refused to comply. He just wasn't going to do it. So eventually they speak to Haman about this to see if he's going to tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them, importantly, that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. Now, when you read a story like this in the Bible, you should be asking, what's actually happening here? What's the source of the conflict? Like what has transpired, or what is kind of out in the ether that's causing Mordecai to not show Haman the respect that he's due? Even respect that the king has said everybody must provide. What is really going on here? Well, it turns out, at least from my perspective, that there's 3 answers of what it could possibly be, and it may even be a little bit of each or a strange combination of the 3. The first one is this. It may not seem immediately obvious, but it's entirely possible. This could be plain human pride. Herodotus, who gives us a historical retelling of the Persian Empire, tells us that Persians of equal rank would greet each other with a kiss on the mouth. You thought this was nasty. Just walk up and lay a smooch on. Hey, buddy. And then people of slightly lower value or position, they would kiss on the cheek, something that you may be more familiar with in the world at large. But if there was a huge distinction between the position of this person and this person, then prostration, bowing down, getting low was necessary. These were just the basic societal standards. So Mordecai could be saying of human pride, Haman, you're not that much higher a position than me. Ain't no way I'm bowing down. It's possible. I don't think it's likely. The text doesn't give us a whole lot of reasons to think that way, but it's entirely possible. The second reason that he could be refusing to bow could be something to do with just his general Jewishness. This story might bring up another story in your brain from the same area. You remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? What did they refuse to do that got them thrown in the fiery furnace? They refused to bow down, but this was a little bit different. Not just to a man for honor, but to a statue to worship. Okay? So I think it's easy to read this and think that Mordecai is taking the high ground spiritually. But when you read the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, there's absolutely nothing that says that you can't bow to a position of higher authority than you just as a societal mark of honor or reverence. In fact, it happened all the time. Israelite kings expected people to bow down in front of them. And Mordecai seems to have no problem bowing in front of the king of Persia. So it's not likely, I don't think, that he's doing this from just a spiritual high ground of I'm a Jew and Jews don't bow. There's a third possibility, which I think is most likely, but it's not the easiest to come up with off the surface reading, and it's this. Haman, we're told in the text, is an Agagite. Let me break that down. I think the text is actually telling us that Haman is an Amalekite, spiritually speaking. Do you remember when the people were crossing the Jordan River and they were going to take the entire promised land, and God said, take out this people group, take out this people group, take out this people group, and inhabit the land? Deuteronomy 25 says this: God commands Israel, once they are to settle the land, to be agents of his promise and to war against the Amalekites until they are blotted out from memory forever. It doesn't happen right away, but it's actually the charge that God asks Saul to do in 1 Samuel 15. Do you remember this? He says, Saul, it's time. It's time to fulfill this command. I need you to rally an army, and 1 Samuel says this: attack the Amalekites and destroy everything that belongs to them. Here's where it gets really gruesome. Put to death the men, the women, the children, the infants, the cattle, the sheep, the camels, the donkeys, everything. Do you remember what Saul does? He keeps the things he wants to keep, and he keeps the king as a pet. This was something that used to happen in the ancient world, pretty grotesque. When you conquered another city or nation state, you'd take their king, oftentimes do something gruesome to their undercarriage, and then keep them as servants. It's a way to have a trophy of battles past. God said, don't do that. Saul did that. You know who that king was? King Agag, from the Agagites. The Amalekites hated the Jews. They were willing to raid and do anything to take them over. That's why God said, you just can't allow them to continue to exist here. They'll be the bane of your existence forever. After this moment where Saul fails, all of the nations around Israel that would continue to raid them, that just hated them for no reason, were called Agagites. Haman is an Agagite. Someone who is literally from a people group who hates everything to do with the Jews and wants to blot them out from the earth. So it's entirely possible that Mordecai says, ain't no way I'm bowing to the mortal enemy of my people. Who knows? The truth is, we don't know. We don't know Mordecai's reason for not bowing, but we do know the effect, and I don't think Mordecai ever imagined it was going to happen. His stubborn behavior goes way beyond him and implicates his entire people. Here's how Haman responds. Verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage, for he had learned Mordecai's nationality. This is why it becomes important that he was a Jew. So he's decided in pure spiritual Amalekite fashion, it's not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all of the Jews throughout the empire of Xerxes. It's carryover evil from the first 2 chapters, right? Because the way that we deal with conflict with an individual is to hurt anybody associated with them, right? That's cool, calm, and rational. Just like Xerxes, who was offended by Vashti not obeying his propositional ask, takes it out on every beautiful woman in the nation. It's a horrible carryover of evil and disgusting stuff. Think about this. Have you guys ever been mistreated, at least from your perspective, by somebody who knew some family member of yours who harmed them? Like maybe you had a crazy uncle who made everybody mad in a certain area, and then when you try to do business there, like it's just not going to work because you're associated with them. Think about that, which is probably a common occurrence, but add a malicious intent that says it's not just enough for you not to do business. I want you out of town. I want your whole family out of town. In fact, I want you dead. That is what's going on here with Haman. It's intense. So he hatches a plan, and he approaches King Xerxes and bribes him with what's the equivalent of an entire nation's tribute for a whole year. All the different provinces, what they would bring as a tribute to the king, he says, I'll give it all to you at once if you're willing to just put up with one little thing. You know what it turns out to be? 333 tons of silver. That's a lot of money. Have you ever wanted to hurt somebody that bad? Like, this is intense. This is animosity that goes generations back. I'll give you 333 tons of silver if you allow for one little thing, the systematic annihilation of every single Jew in your entire empire. Here's how he says it. He says it a little bit more covertly. Verse 8, when Haman approached King Xerxes, he said, there's a certain race of people scattered through all the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everybody else. Their laws are different than those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it's not in the king's best interest to allow them to live. And we've learned from chapter 1 and 2 that all that matters is the king's interest, right? So Xerxes agrees. He says, the money, verse 11, and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit. So word goes out to the entire Persian Empire, explaining that all of the Jews, verse 13, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen March 7th of the next year, like a purge. The property of the Jews would be given to anyone who killed them as an incentive. What a plan. Could you imagine receiving that letter in the mail? It's not a letter from the IRS saying you're getting audited. It's a letter that says, hey, come March 7th next year, you and your family are fair game. What? Just like today, geopolitical decisions aren't made with the best intentions of the average person. They're made because of what the elite want to do and how it best serves them. In fact, we learn how the responses can be mixed here. Verse 15, at the king's command, a decree went out by swift messengers, and it was proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. And then the king and Haman sat down to drink. It was like a cocktail lunch between legislative, agendas. But the city of Susa fell into confusion, just like things in our world today, when bribery and corruption and everything else reigns at the top. Everybody else deals with the pain. I think for whatever reason Mordecai was refusing to bow, good intention or not, or a mix of it, there's no way that he thought, hey, my individual action is going to lead to every single person that I'm even remotely associated with being wiped off the face of the planet. Just like you never thought the one decision to tell a lie to your spouse would erode your entire trust. Just like you never thought that taking, a $20 bill out of the register at your hourly wage job was really going to, have a cascading effect on your life that led you down a wrong path. Little choices matter, it turns out. When Mordecai learned, chapter 4, verse 1, all that had been done, he tore his clothes. He put on burlap and ashes and went into the city, crying with a loud and bitter wail. He went as far as the gate of the palace, for no one was allowed to enter the palace gate while wearing clothes of mourning. And it turns out his response is typical of all the Jews in the entire empire. Verse 3, and the news of the king's decree reached all the provinces, and there was great mourning among the Jews. They fasted, they wept, they wailed, and many people put on burlap sacks and ashes. This last line is typical of Jewish lament, which is not a word that we like to talk about because lamentation isn't fun and it's not proper. And it feels weird to allow like all of the emotions that we have to be publicly seen. But the reality is ancient Jewish people thought differently than we do about taking in all the junk that happens in our life. They thought action spoke louder than words. So when crazy stuff happened in their lives and they had no choice but to turn back to God, they showed up and showed out. They put all of their emotions on display for everybody to see. They risked it because they believed that if they publicly confessed their sins and asked God to relent, that God would be faithful even when they weren't faithful. It's interesting to me that this is the first we see at all in this entire book that has to do with spiritual piety. You know, they're not reading God's scripture in advance to make good decisions. They're not singing songs and spiritual songs and praises and all this stuff all throughout. Only when their entire world falls apart do they turn to God. And you know what? That's typical of Christians in our world today. We don't got time for God in our everyday life. Hello? Hello. Should I rewind? Everybody's like, please no, just continue on. I'll continue on. Esther freaks out. She sees Mordecai freaking out. She hears all of everybody else screaming and freaking out. And so she sends him clothes because he can't come in when he's wearing burlap and all this other junk. And he says, I don't want it. So she wants to speak to him. She has to speak to him through her personal eunuch attendant. What happens is, verse 7, Mordecai tells him the whole story, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa that called for the death of all the Jews. He asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. He also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king to beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Essentially, Mordecai tells Esther, we need your help. You're in this position for a reason. Your people need your help. And what's Esther's response going to be? Well, it's the Bible, right? So we expect Esther to rise to the occasion. That's got to be what happens. Of course, when she's needed most, she's going to stand up for her people. Well, we get verse 10. Then Esther tells Hathach to go back and relay this other message to Mordecai. All the king's officials, and even the people of the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his golden scepter. The king hasn't called for me to come to him in 30 days. Let me summarize. I can't help. I could get hurt. That's what she's saying. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in this world. There's a lot of ways we could help. But if I risk it, I mean, it could come back and hurt me. If I stand up for this person at work, I might get stabbed in the back next. If I don't cheat on the test when everybody else is cheating on the test, it's going to be my GPA that suffers, not everybody else's. I can't help. I could get hurt. I think she's also maybe saying, I can't help because I'd be risking everything that I've finally been able to build here. I never asked for any of this. Now I've finally got some sense of stability in my life, and you're asking me to put everything on the line? It seems like maybe she's fallen in love with the sinful situation that she's been put in, and I wonder if anybody here has done the same. Fallen in love with and become comfortable with the sinful position that you've been put in. Whether it was your sin or somebody else's, it's provided stability in your life. I imagine she was thinking or wanting to tell Mordecai, like, look, I've never been able to make it on my own. I've always, I came from this bad background. I was an orphan, and I finally have something to call my own. How dare you ask me to stand up on principle? I think it's worth dwelling on this just for a second to see the difference between Esther's character in the moment than some of the other characters that we've already talked about. Think about Daniel. He's in captivity. Daniel refuses to eat anything that is unclean. It makes everybody mad. He refuses to stop praying to his God, even when there's laws against it. And where does he find himself? In a lion's den. Refuses to compromise. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which we just talked about, all they had to do was bow down before an idol. Everybody else is doing it. Refuse to compromise, end up in a fiery furnace. Esther compromises her walk with God at every step of the story. Every step. It's not as if she doesn't have reason for it. Her life was hard, but she compromises in every single way. She keeps her identity hidden, even when it might save her people. She would have consistently disobeyed the Jewish dietary laws. That may not matter to you or I, but it mattered to the Jewish people. She married a pagan king. The Torah says you can't do that. Every step of her story so far, she's compromised her walk with God to get to where she is and to have the stability that she has. And now that she finally has the position and the power and the influence to do something about the suffering of her people, she chooses self-preservation. Why does God want to use Esther? Why would he choose somebody like that? Not a Daniel, not a Shadrach or a Meshach or one of the other prophets of old. I can't help. I could get hurt. And did you know that it's not until what most prominent interpreters see as a veiled threat that she even changes her mind? Mordecai sends another message to her. This is pretty intense. Imagine how this would have sounded to you if you were getting this message. How would you interpret it? Don't think, he says in verse 13, for a moment that because you're in the palace, you'll escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise, because he believes in God's promise, from another place. But you and your relatives will die. No one knows she's a Jew. What's he threatening here? But listen to this next line. Who knows? Perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. See, in Mordecai's mind, Esther's life is in jeopardy whether she goes before the king or not. And if you're her and you hear that, like you're going to die no matter what, you must be thinking, is he about to tell on me? Sure, there's the promise, right? Maybe you were made for such a time as this. Perhaps she's inspired purely by that. You're right, Mordecai. I should be brave. Maybe it's a little bit of bravery and fear mixed together. Like if I'm not brave, I'm gonna die. We don't know her motives. We never get Esther's motives. We never hear her thoughts. We don't even get the thoughts or the motives of Mordecai. And you know who we're also not hearing the thoughts and motives of? God. All we get consistently through the book of Esther is this line, who knows? Who knows? Perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. So she responds. Esther sends a message to Mordecai. Go and gather all of the Jews in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, Mordecai, come on, man, I will go and see the king. If I must die, I must die. Most of your translations say, if I perish, I perish. Who knows? Maybe it was the veiled threat. Maybe it was her just saying, yes, God has more for me. One way or another, she says, I'm going to choose who God says I am. I want to read really quickly before we close a portion from the book of Joel, written more than 100 years before. That sounds exactly like this story. This is why the Lord says, turn to me now while there is still time. Give me your hearts. Come with fasting, weeping, and mourning. Don't just tear your clothes in grief, tear your hearts instead. Return to the Lord your God, for he is merciful and compassionate, slow to get angry, filled with unfailing love, eager to relent and not punish. Who knows? Perhaps he'll give you a reprieve, sending you a blessing instead of this curse. Perhaps you'll be able to offer grain and wine to the Lord as you did before. Emphasis on the who knows. Who knows? Perhaps you were made for such a time as this. Perhaps you're in the situation that you're at right now through your sin or somebody else's sin or just by happenstance. But maybe it's not just happenstance. Maybe God's been working behind the scenes through it all. No one knows that Esther is a Jew unless Mordecai reveals it, but yet she's willing to choose her Jewish identity rather than her pagan one. Did you know that Esther is the only person in this book who has two names recorded? Remember this from the beginning when she's introduced as the cousin of Mordecai? She's first introduced by her Jewish name, Hadassah, or the Persian name, Esther. She is being given a choice in this moment to identify as God's chosen people and stand up and step into her calling that God has positioned her for, or to slouch back into her new pagan comfortable identity and try to ride it out and keep it secret. Who are you in life's hardest moments? When you're up against the wall, when the illusions have fallen, when you've not listened to God's will and you find yourself in a pinch, who are you going to be? Are you going to choose to rely on him? Say, I'm Christ's and he is mine and I'm going to act the way he wants me to act, even if I've put myself in this situation. In this moment, I'm going to choose to be his. I'm coming back to God. I believe his mercy is still good for me. He can forgive me. He has a plan and purpose for me. Or are you going to slink into the darkness and allow whatever to pass? Who are you in life's hardest moments? I imagine when Mordecai shot back at Esther, she said, why me? Why me? I didn't ask for any of this. I just want to be left alone. Mordecai, do you have any idea what I've been through? I've been through so much. Isn't it enough? John Goldengay, who's a prominent Old Testament interpreter, says, we see in Esther's fear and trepidation something that magnifies the fact that she's willing to step up in the moment, because she didn't choose any of this. She was in this position simply because she was a beautiful Jew. But now, simply because she's a beautiful Jew, she has the chance to save her entire people. And I believe that when we read this, we can see ourselves in the story. We can realize that even when we come back to God reluctantly, when there's no other option but to come back to him for the wrong reasons, when we put ourselves in a position that we have no other option at all, we are now in a position where we can receive God's mercy afresh and anew. The answer to why God would use Esther is the same reason why he uses you and me. Because I've read the Daniel story a bunch of times. I don't identify too much with Daniel. Do you? My guess would be everybody in this room at one point in their life or another has compromised their Christian convictions to stay with the person they're with, to get ahead at work, to enjoy social status and comfort, to just feel good in the moment. I don't know what your compromise is. I know what mine has been. I think way more of us today identify with Esther than Daniel. Esther than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because when we were asked to bow, we bowed. But guess what? God can still use you because God still used Esther. She compromised every step of the way, but she found through God's goodness and sovereignty and grace that even in those compromises, he was working. the position that she gets into because of her sin and other people's sin, God uses to liberate his entire people. His promise comes true for the world in Christ, in part because Esther said, I choose to identify with him instead of my sin in my past. I choose to risk it for the biscuit. So what are you going to do today? Who are you in life's toughest moments? The call of Esther, chapter 3 and 4, is to risk it for the biscuit. No matter why you're in the position you're in your life right now, Esther chapter 3 and chapter 4 says, will you choose to be identified with Jesus or the ways of this world? Choose God. Don't miss the moment God has positioned you for. Be brave. Even if it's not from the greatest position. Return to God. And he'll restore your life. And he'll probably help restore others as well.